So, Into the Heart of Medieval Scotland, a fictional Odyssey that forged a nation's soul. So I think it's, these are my personal reflections. So you're very welcome to disagree, but that I'm very much talking as a personal view. So I'll state that right out at the beginning. I think the years of that I'm specifically talking about are 1286 to 1329. And why did I pick 1286 to 1329? They're fundamentally the years that the Scottish independence wars and political disagreements were happening during those years. They weren't fighting all the time with England mostly. They were started in 1286 with the death of King Alexander III. He died without a male heir. He had a granddaughter, and I'll talk about her in a minute. And 1329 was the year that Robert the Bruce died. And the agreement that basically settled the first wars of independence happened in 1327. We were still arguing with England well into the 14th century, in Edward III's period of his reign. And there was a second wars of independence. I think the years between about 1327 and about 1360 were almost like a truce with skirmishes. So the years that I'm specifically talking about, and my books are set in those years of 1286 to 1329. And I think they made such a difference to Scotland as a country, and set so much up, and secured our independence for 300 years, that I think they were a pivotal and significant period of time in Scotland's history. So, for me, I think it made us the nation we are. So that's why I wrote about it. And I always say, if you're ever deciding to write a novel, write about something that you know about and you're interested in and you're excited about and motivated about. And I'm particularly motivated about these years. Without sounding too pretentious and too sort of self-interested and self-promoting. My mother was a Wishart and my father was an Irvin. That's my maiden name. I'm actually married to a Norwegian, which is why I met Sally. So the Wisharts and the Irvins played quite an important role in the wars of independence. So, I thought to myself, well, it's nice to write about the family and keep them in people's minds, even if some of it is fictionalized. And the two people I kind of used initially were Bishop Wishart, who was a real guy. He died in about 1316. He was born around 1240. He was the Bishop of Glasgow, and his tomb is in the crypt of Glasgow. He was a very interesting character, and he sacrificed a great deal for what he believed in. So, a man of considerable integrity from what we know about him. The other person I wrote out is a guy called William de Irwin, and he was a nobleman. In fact, the Irvins were Scottish from as far as I can find out. The Wisharts came over with the Norman French at the time of the conquest, and in turn had been descended from the Norwegian Norsemen. So the kind of they came from Norway, went to France, and came back to Scotland. And here's me back in Norway. So there's a bit of a wee tale there as well. The Irvins became allies, minor landowners on the borders, ended up becoming Bruce's allies, and eventually did very well out of it all, and have a big castle up in a place called Drum, which is just outside Aberdeen. So that was really the sort of family connections, and the interest I have was generated in these years. And I think there's a lot of themes and culturals and beliefs that haven't changed really in the sort of 600 years or 700 years since these events happened. So historical fiction, in terms of the historical aspects of it all, I think are just as relevant today. And I've tried to keep as true to the story as possible. So I haven't changed real events. I've tried to keep to the events when I can, and when there's gaps, I've invented things which I think might bridge the gaps where history or where records are missing. So I've talked a little bit about myself. I won't focus too much about this. So I've written 3 books. I've got a 4th book coming out late summer, which is called The Murders at St Olaf's Priory. And the 3 books are called Ray's Dragon, Revenge of the Tyrants, and The Bruce's Treasure. And they're a chronological progression from 1286 through to 1329, and the last book will be focusing on that latter part of the wars. I've done a lot of research, and I've tried to find commonality, but between those times and now. But also, I've looked at I've looked at places I wasn't expecting to find confirmation of the parallels between what's going on now in Scotland in terms of independence to what was going on in 1306. And funny enough, they just like fallen out of the sky. So there's, the themes are I think are very relevant to what people are reading today. And even though they're set, as I say, 800 years ago, I've tried to do research into not only Scottish history, but Norwegian history, French history, and I've put in Byzantine history, which I think is a very understudied piece and underwritten about in terms of people don't hear a lot about the Byzantines. And I think they were one guy described them, I think John Romer, the archaeologist, again, was the lost empire. And I think that's very true. They were a huge influence on the medieval world, and I don't think they get quite the same level of interest as Western history does. So they're included in my books too. Obviously a great advocate for history to be understood, and history that's not necessarily palatable. All my heroes are not necessarily all good guys, and my villains are not necessarily always bad guys all the time. There's a lot of people who did things for their own self-interest, and of course things that hasn't changed either. And I feel there's quite a lot of relevance in what I've written to modern audiences. Trying to talk about, I don't think they were that different people of those times. They had all the same Maslow type needs for security and love and food and safety. I don't think that changed. It was a crueler world. It was a harder world. I think we've got slightly less violent, but nevertheless, I think there's still, as I say, parallels and great commonality between people who were alive in those days and people that are alive now. And unfortunately, history writes about the nobility and it writes about rich people. It doesn't write about poor people. So again, I've had to, gauge their feelings and their attitudes and their morality and all the type of views and feelings that they've had based on very much on how I would have viewed the world and how I see other people viewing the world. So again, I think fiction is very useful in maybe bringing those aspects of normal life and putting them on a page and presenting them to people. So the next one is why medieval.
Will you let me know?
Oh yes, yeah. If you could go to the
when I should change the slides.
Yes, if you could go to Why Medieval Scotland, that would be nice. Slide 3. Okay.
Yeah,
you see a map of Scotland.
It should be showing slide 3 now.
Slide 2 is just basically what I've just talked about. It's about me. So why medieval Scotland? So I've talked about how it was fundamentally important period of time to Scotland and making, establishing Scotland as a nation and ensuring Scotland survived for another 300 years. It also was a bit of a mixture of there was lots of stuff going on internally. There was the south of Scotland and up to the middle of Scotland, up to Stirling, a lot of Norman French, the old Gaelic aristocracy, people who'd been there since, the very early times of Scotland. They were kind of centred in the sort of southwest and a sort of a ribbon and corridor right up to where, the top of Scotland on the right-hand side. Then you had the Norse and the Norwegian influence very much in the islands and at the north and the Western Isles and Caithness. They spoke a form of Norwegian right up into the 13th century. And then you have people are very obsessed with the Highlanders and the Gaels. They were on the east coast and the west coast, and they were very much their own people, and there was the MacDonalds were a clan that operated in there in Argyllshire. The Bruces were very much in Annandale, and they looked in Dumfries, and then you had the Commons. You don't hear the name Common too much now. It's been changed into Cumming. They were probably the largest clan at that point in time, prior to the beginning of the 14th century. And they were very much antagonists of the Bruce, and they were around the same area of Dumfriesshire as the Bruces. So they, as well as up towards Aberdeenshire, they had lands there. So this was a kind of quite a fragmented set of politics. Actually, the Scottish king was that we had a succession of very strong kings throughout the 11th, 12th, 13th century. They tended to rule for quite a long time relative to the English in terms of, their 20, 30 years, 40 years rulers. They were descended from King Malcolm Canmore. His house survived from the 11th century right through to the 1286 when King Alexander died. So even though there was quite a lot of factionalism and there was skirmishes, on the whole, Scotland was quite a stable country in the 13th and 14th century. It was with the death of the king that things started to change. So that's just a little bit of a landscape and a description. And there was quite a lot, myths and, tales of the Pictish warriors. There's no written history, so a lot of Scottish history prior to maybe the 8th, 7th, 8th century when the church took over is an oral history. Pictish stones and stone circles. There's quite a lot of stuff that we don't know, but there's a lot of evidence of it in the islands and in the north, Orkney, Shetland, north of Scotland, to suggest that it was a bigger player than any written history suggests. But this is the landscape in 1306, which is when my books are set. If you could go on to this next slide, please. It should be titled Fiction as a Historical Method. Okay. You got a nice picture of Robert the Bruce? Yes? Can you hear me?
Yes, that's your
yes, word. Okay. All right. So my books are not are fictionalized. They are not history books. And there's lots of people who are far more qualified to write them. So I think I feel quite justified in people reading my books and saying, well, that's maybe how it was. I'd say 80%, 70 to 80% of the books have got a lot of are non-fiction, are verifiable activities, and I'd say 70% of the characters actually existed. Whether they acted in the way I've described is another matter, but I've tried to reconstruct between the gaps how I think people behave towards each other, and I used all the same emotions that you would do of anger, revenge, vindictiveness, temptation, love, lust, all the same stuff, to suggest how they might have driven these actions that actually happened. And a lot of it was about power. A lot of it was about ruling. Who didn't want to be the king? Nobody. Everybody wanted to be the king. And Bruce wanted to be the king. Comyn wanted to be the king, and quite a few other people wanted to be the king. Even King Eric of Norway tried to claim he should be king of Scotland because his daughter, he was the heir to his daughter. Let me come to her and just explain a little bit about her. So I've explained that Alexander died in 1286. He had two sons. One of his sons died 2 years prior to his death in 1294. His daughter had died in childbirth in 1293. And he had a granddaughter who was called Margaret, and she was the daughter of another Margaret and the King of Norway, King Eric. She was his heir, and she was brought over in 1290 to ostensibly, I think, marry the English king's son and unify the crowns. And then I'm assuming that the English would have taken over then. But she died in Orkney. Some say she died of seasickness, some say she died of dysentery. There's a whole variety of theories. about what happened to her. But she essentially was out of the picture in 1290, and that allowed the English king, to get a foothold in Scotland, which had not been um, available to any English kings prior to sort of 1286. So the death of Margaret was quite a pivotal moment, and that's where the Norwegian element came in. When I originally started writing the books, it was an England-Scotland game. It was a bit, good and evil, as we might say. But I thought that, that's been done a lot by people. So I tried to introduce the other players at the time, and the other players were the King of France, the King of Norway, and the emperors of Byzantium. They were all with each other and fighting each other and undermining each other in different ways. So I thought the books could be richer by adding a little bit more of history. And in more, as the slide says, I would, I offered some interpretive frameworks about why they did what they did. And I tried to engage, people who are interested in all sorts of different things and what the relationships could be between all these powerful and competing nations. So if we go to the next slide, please, which should be just mentioning my books. So again, the books there's 8 of them. I've mapped out the first 5, and the next one is called The Murders at St. Olaf's Priory. That has them going up to Greenland, and that was much before President Trump thought it was a good place to start, potentially trying to take over. But I was I'm writing about a place that has not had a lot of publicity in the past. And they had quite a rich history and quite an interesting place in the medieval times, and that's what book 4 is all about. And then book 5, again, it's a little bit more about what was going on in medieval Europe. Relics were a big business. The Templars were behind a lot of the relics, and they made a lot of money out of that. So within the books telling a story about Scottish independence, they also tell us the stories about what was going on at that point in time. Ray's Dragon has the fall of Acre and escaping from that. That was a big pivotal moment for Christendom in terms of having to leave the Holy Land. And fundamentally, after that, there was no more crusades. That was the end of the crusading world. The Revenge of the Tyrants is really about Edward trying to move in Scotland, and the King of France trying to stop him and trying to stop the Scots. And then the British treasure, there's an underlying theme of a treasure that belonged to the Byzantiums that has been stolen from them by the Crusaders. And that's a theme that goes through all of the books. And then we have the treasure moving away up to Greenland, and then it goes somewhere else after that. I won't tell you any more stories. So it's not just a story about, as I say, independence, it's also a story about what was going on in the world at that point in time. So if you could move to the next slide, which is slide 6, which is talking about the key events in the Scottish Wars of Independence. So this kind of tells you what the framework, the binding of the books are, and all these events are discussed. So 1286, the succession crisis, death of Alexandra, and then the death of Margaret. So Margaret was King Edward I's great niece. Her grandmother had been Edward I's sister. Her mother had been Edward I's niece, and Margaret was his great niece. So he was related. He was actually Alexander III's brother-in-law. So, there was a connection there. No love lost between families. And then we have, in 1290, the Scots, for reasons beyond description and beyond belief, they trusted Edward, who was a statesman and had been, well respected. He had been a crusader in the 1270s. 1270s. He'd have been a crusader, come back, quite well respected, tough cookie, good king on the whole for England. And the Scots were arguing amongst themselves about who the next king should be. There was 13 competitors, invited King Edward to come in. He used this as an opportunity not just to adjudicate on who should be the next king, but he also used it as an opportunity to take Scotland over, as he'd done in Wales. Scotland had been more difficult to conquer because, firstly, it was further away from the king's base in the south of England. Wales was much nearer. He could supply Wales. He could supply his garrisons and his armies. Scotland was up north, and some parts of northern England were less than loyal to the king even at that time. And when you got to Scotland, the supply lines were quite stretched, so it was more difficult to conquer Scotland at that point in time. But the fact that we didn't have a king and we'd had strong kings up to that point also gave him another opportunity to try and occupy a weakened state. So he adjudicated in 1292, probably the right guy in terms of legality was a guy called John Balliol. He became king in 1292, and he has always been quite ridiculed. He's called Tum Tabard, which means empty coat. He was quite ineffectual, but he did actually stand up to Edward, which was probably why he ended up being dethroned by Edward, because he was the one that started the Old Alliance in 1295. And the Old Alliance was not just France and Scotland, it was France, Scotland, and Norway. The Norwegians stepped back, but it's now just looked at as being an agreement between Scotland and France. And it was basically a war, an agreement where each one would help the other if they were attacked. In fact, in reality, France never really lifted much of a sword to help Scotland at any point in time. It was actually only I think taken off the statute books in the beginning of the 20th century. Up to that point, I think 1905, Scottish people could get French passports. So there you go. That would have been very useful now. But there was a very close, and there still is a very close relationship between Scotland and France as a result of that. And it was John Balliol who set up that agreement. That and the fact he didn't like having to send Scottish soldiers to fight in the English wars in France, and he kept getting called down to England to to be told off, and Scottish courts were overruled by English laws, and there was lots of stuff. Maybe I suggest that Edward was provoking, and as a result of what he did, John Balliol stood up to him. There was a battle, 1296 in Dunbar, I think April 1296. That was after there was a massacre at Berwick, which was at that point the richest borough in Scotland because they'd resisted the English invasion. And it culturally quite an important thing in Dunbar, because Dunbar set up the risings that happened between Wallace and Bruce and all the things that happened afterwards. Even Dunbar was a disaster for the Scottish Army. They were dispersed with one cavalry charge. And that in Berwick, I think, set up Scotland to be rebellious. And I think that's quite an important thing that's not actually here, but Battle of Dunbar, April 1296. Edward came up to Scotland and he tried to basically strip Scotland of its cultural heritage and its cultural memory. So when we're talking about why is fiction important in Scottish history, it's because quite a lot of the records were taken away in 1296 and the years afterwards and were taken back down to England. When James VI of Scotland became King of England in 1603, he sent back the records back to Scotland. Unfortunately, there was a shipwreck and they went to the bottom of the North Sea. So there's quite a lot of documentation about what was happening prior to 1296 that got taken away by England and has been lost to history, including the stone of Scone was taken from Scone Abbey. He actually purposely went there because that's where the Scottish kings were crowned, thinking if you took the stone away, then you couldn't crown the king, or the king had no legitimacy if he was crowned. I think he was given a duff piece of sandstone. I think it's hidden somewhere still, and that'll be something I'll be writing about in the books as well. I don't think we were offered it back in the 1320s and we refused it. So I think they knew it wasn't the real one, and I still think it wasn't the real one. But the attempt to remove it had cultural significance because they were trying to stop Scotland having a king again. And in fact, at that time, they called it the lands of Scotland rather than the kingdom of Scotland. So they were already trying to take that away. And that's why the Scottish Wars of Independence was so important, because they brought that back in. So in 1297, you had the Battle of Stirling Bridge, and that's, the Braveheart one. It's not quite how it was portrayed there. It was really trying to cross a bridge, letting half the army get over and then massacring them either side of the bridge. But it was a significant victory because the common man, because most Scots noblemen fought with their troops on foot, whereas the English armies fought with knights. So there was quite a cultural difference about how we actually fought. So Battle of Stirling Bridge was a real surprise for England because a bunch of commoners on foot with spears took down, hundreds of knights. It was quite a massacre. Also, as I said, Dunbar generated a lot of rebellions. Wallace was in the south of Scotland. We're not too sure what Bruce was doing, whether he was with the English at that point in time or whether he was with Wallace. We're not too sure. He was with Moray. And then in the north of Scotland, there was a guy called Andrew de Moray who doesn't get quite the publicity he deserves because he died shortly after the Battle of Stirling Bridge. He was one of the few Scottish nobles who died as a result of his wounds. Maybe if he'd been in the scene, Bruce might not have had the clear run that he did because I think maybe he had aspirations. But that whole period of time, 1297, victory for Scotland, 1298, we lost at Falkirk. And then between 1298 and 1303, the English more or less occupied Scotland and it was more or less over. There's a couple more significant battles. There's the Battle of Rosalind in 1303, which actually helped Scotland get a breathing space. And that was actually led by a villain of the peace, which I'll talk about later, called John Comyn. And he was the guy that Bruce killed at the altar in Greyfriars Church. He was a competitor too he had a right to the Scottish throne. So Bruce and him fought. There was not room for two of them. And there is some evidence that Comyn was betraying independence and would have been a vassal to the English king in return for Edward's support to make him king. Comyn had been actually quite a leader of the rebellion that broke out between 1298, 1299 and 1303. He'd been actually one of the commanders of the Scottish armies at Roslin, and Wallace had been at Roslin too. So there was, Comyn was a complete English agent. He was actually had fought quite hard for Scotland. He'd given up by 1306 because maybe he thought it was a political way of getting what he wanted and being king, and that was to throw his lot in with the English king and get basically Bruce out of the way. They met, and I talk about this in my books, in Greyfriars in 1306, in February 1306. Did Bruce go there to kill him? I'm not sure. I think Bruce showed it probably should have happened. Whether it should have happened at the altar in Greyfriars Church probably wasn't the politically sound thing to do. And I talk about my books how that's viewed by Bishop Wishart. He was the political mind behind Bruce's campaign and had been a political supporter of Wallace too. Where Wishart came in is he wanted the independence of the Scottish Church. He did not want to be an archbishop in the English Church or the Scottish branch of the English Church, because the Scottish Church had much more autonomy than the English Church. The English Church was much more controlled by the monarch. And the English government still appoints the Archbishop of Canterbury even now. So he wanted to maintain it because he had more power. So, there's a bit of selfishness there. And then we have 1314, of course, etched in everyone's memory, who's Scottish, the Battle of Bannockburn, which did change. It basically stopped England invading Scotland for a number of years, 15 years. It didn't mean the English gave up. In fact, they tried to get Scotland censured by the Pope for winning, which is an interesting concept. But it basically kept the English King Edward II lost at Bannockburn. It basically destroyed a lot of his reputation in the eyes of his noblemen. Huge number of his noblemen were killed or ransomed. It probably was one of the pivotal moments in his decline. He was eventually overthrown in 1327, and the English Queen Isabella, his wife, and her son took over. And I think one of the reasons why the 1328 Treaty of Edinburgh and Northampton happened was because she had more problems in England and they just wanted Scotland to go away. So that was an important elements in what happened in England influenced what their attitude to Scotland and the capability to be able to fight in Scotland. And I think one last thing on this in terms of the historical framework, one of the most important documents, and I think one of the key things that Scotland gave to the world was no longer was the king, he made all the decisions. The Declaration of Broth is the first time in any document that says if the king doesn't rule his people wisely and fairly, and we can get rid of you. So, and that ended up being in the American American Declaration of Independence in 1776. It was taken over there as a document or as a theory over to America by Witherspoon, not the guy who runs the pub, but the bloke who was involved in the American Declaration of Independence, who was a Scottish clergyman. So that kind of gives you the key things on what happened, how we moved from succession crisis through to independence secured. So if you wouldn't mind going over to slide 7, please. Which should be the clan structures.
Yes, that should be the one that's up now.
Yep. So, clans had there was much more of it in the later part of the sort of 17th, 16th, 17th century. The clan structure was more established there. That doesn't mean to say it wasn't there in the medieval times. There was a lot of clans that had a lot of influence. The MacDonalds were over in Argyllshire. The Campbells were in also in North Argyllshire, but they were the MacDonalds were in the islands, and the MacDonalds, sorry, the Campbells were in on the mainland. We had the MacDougalls, very interesting. They were a big rival of the Bruces, and they were allies of the Commons. The Commons were up in they were all over actually. They were, as I say, the strongest clan going into the beginning of the 14th century. They ended up getting annihilated because they chose the wrong side. They originally threw in the lot, as I've explained, with England, and ended up as a result of the Bruce recapturing the Scottish mainland, basically piece by piece. The Cummins ended up becoming a much, almost like they died out. In fact, their main branch died out in the 14th century. A couple of guys got killed. They died in battle, and they went into exile because they were Bruce's strongest enemy in 1306. The clans did look after each other. There was alliances. There was an honor culture, if you could ever call it that. They killed people just as easily as when they wanted to. There was a patronage network. The Douglases used the Bruce patronage to very much grow their lands and their power post 1306. We have Angus Og, the Lord of the Isles, who became, was one of Bruce's early allies. He ended up getting his Lord of the Isles title as a result of what he did during the Wars of Independence. MacDougall's definitely suffered. This is just a sort of, a map of some of the alliances and places that you can go and visit even now. I mean, for example, my own Irvins were fighting with the Keiths all the time. The Johnsons were fighting with the Armstrongs. They're down in the border, and the Keiths and the Irvins were up near Aberdeen. So some of these, feuds that started then, a little bit of the south of America in terms of they never forgot the Irvins and the Keiths fell out in 1407 and didn't actually make it up until 1952 or something. So, we know how to hold a grudge in Scotland. So, 500 years of feuds. So, but, it wasn't all like that. The clan structure, I think, became more romanticized in the later part of the, as I say, 16th, 17th and 18th century. But that's just giving you a flavour of how it was in 1306. If you could go on to the next slide, which is women in medieval Scotland. So in my books, I talk about some good, very strong female characters. And these people existed. So Isabella of France, who married King Edward II, she had a great influence, and she was called the She of France. Very strong-minded lady, descended from the King of France, who's in the books, King Philip IV. Deposed and somebody murdered her husband, probably she did. So she's a very strong character. She appears in the book. So she was a real person who existed. Christina, who was a lover of Robert the Bruce, again, she existed, had lands in the Western Isles, and I get her teaching the Bruce a little bit about how to keep hold of lands, because if you were a woman in those times, it was much harder. In Scotland, men were still more important than women and had a bit more legal rights and could hold more land. But there were some subtle differences between Scotland and England. The English very much, if you went to court, you had to have your husband there. If you wanted to do, your lands went to your husband. In Scotland, we had a thing called terce. So even in those days, even if you had a son, the widow was entitled to a third of the land. Women's played a bigger part in commerce in Scotland. There's a lot of historical records that show women at court cases and fighting for, their rights and conducting business, owning land, and I mentioned that in my books. I also talk about, Bruce's sister Isabella, who was Queen of Norway, and she stayed in Norway after she died, after her husband died, and she became a little bit of a diplomat, because we'd been fighting with Norway in the 1250s and 1260s, so relationships were still a little bit fragile. And Isabella married into the Norwegian royal family, had a daughter, stayed in Norway, I think, to maintain her daughter's rights. And she very much, I think, helped the Bruce with some of his diplomatic relations with not just the Norwegian king. She had relationships with the Swedish king and potentially the Danish king as well. So she, I think, it's not documented fully about what she did, but I think she lived to be a very old lady, 86 or something. So she was, I've used her role as a diplomat in the books. I've also talked about Christina, as I say. I think she hid Bruce in 1306 when he was almost down and out. And there's a very interesting lady that who'll appear in the books, the later books, Isabella Macduff, and she was all the Macduffs were basically the Lords of Buchan, and they were historically the people that crowned the Bruce. Now, Isabella Macduff was married to a cousin of John Comyn, so when John Comyn of Badenoch was killed, her husband threw his lot in with the English king, as did her brother. Her brother would have been the person who crowned the king. But because he was on the English side, he would not have done that. And Isabella very much stuck up for the Bruce. Actually crowned him for a second time. The first time he was crowned in March, she didn't do it, but they were concerned about the legitimacy of his coronation. So the second day, Bruce was crowned again, and she actually did the coronation because she was the next person they had from that particular dukedom. So, very interesting lady, paid a huge price. And these are some of the themes I talk about. A lot of the people that were involved in the Scottish Wars of Independence paid with their lives and willingly. And she was put in a cage for 4 years and hung outside the castle of Berwick. If you see in Outlaw King, they put Bruce's wife. It wasn't Bruce's wife, it was Isabella of Macduff. And his other sister, Mary Bruce, was hung outside Roxburgh in a cage as well. She survived. Isabella, the records are silent after about 1314. And in the prisoner exchange that happened after Bannockburn, when Bruce's wife came back and Bishop Wishart came back, Isabella Macduff is not mentioned. So we suspect she died either just before or just after Bannockburn and wasn't part of that exchange. She would have been probably 29 or 30 when she died. So whatever happened to her, probably ended up killing her. So there you go. There's somebody, and again, I've woven in some of those, those beliefs and maybe thoughts that I've just mentioned to you within the books. Okay, if you could go on, just there's a wee bit about Isabella Macduff and what she did, and yeah, bit of the timeline. Crown, I met a Mac the King. Okay. If you could go on to the one about myth, memory, and identity, please. So, as explained, Scotland didn't have much of a written history before the 8th century. The Scottish, the Scottish documentation, what was being written down, books and everything else, were removed from Scotland. I think the Book of Kells actually was written in Scotland, and that was removed to Ireland to protect it from the English. So there was books sent away from the country, books taken away from the country, and up till about the beginning of the church in Scotland, a lot of the history and the narratives and everything else were very much oral traditions or written in stone and subject to interpretation. Lots of Celtic history and in myths. Some of the saints and the Celtic saints and those of the Gaelics, Side and St. Columba and all that area, again, presented a country that was rich in education and history, and very Christian, but different. It had different origins. Even its Christianity had a high level of Celtic influence, whereas perhaps in England it was more Roman influenced. So a lot of connections between Scotland and Ireland, and still a lot of connections between Scotland and Ireland. So, I talk about the oral traditions and some of the theories, and there's the old one that about Bruce and the spider. That actually wasn't mentioned until Sir Walter Scott in the 19th century, but there is a suggestion that it was a story that was actually happened to James Douglas, who was one of Bruce's generals, and it somehow got projected onto Robert Bruce. So some of the heroic narratives have got that were presented later on, have got an element of truth in them. I mentioned saints and some of the beliefs, and Bruce was a suspicious man, and he had beliefs, Christian beliefs, but he also had some Celtic beliefs, and he was very attached to some of the relics. And if you go into the museum in Scotland, you'll see the Monymusk relic, which is 8th century, which is believed to have been at Bannockburn, with a relic of St. Fillan inside. So I mentioned some of that in the books, again, filling in where there's a gap. Okay, if you could go on to the next one, please, which is slide 11. It says the Independence Chronicle core themes, I think. Okay. Okay, I think all of these are not only themes that we can talk about, and they were real themes that sat behind the events. Bruce lost 3 of his brothers were executed. He had Thomas, Alexander, and Neil were all hung, drawn, and quartered by the English king. His wife was kept away from him to stop him having an heir. His daughter was Edward was going to put her in a cage, and she was only 12 years old. I'm sure that wasn't for the good of her health. So there was a lot of he suffered immensely, incredibly, for his crown. And he was courageous, and he was under a lot of pressure, and he was sick a lot, because I think, the people said he had leprosy. I doubt if he did have leprosy. I think he probably just was worn out by it. He was, at the time of the first one, he was 32, which was a middle-aged man in medieval times, and I think he suffered greatly from the attempts and the battles and the treachery and the treason and you know, all the things that happened to him and happened to his family must have preyed on a man and made him, you know, vulnerable to stress and vulnerable to the illnesses that sit off of that. So I think Bruce was an incredible man. He must have been incredibly strong. He lived to be 55. And you know he paid a huge price, and I think he probably would be a man who could survive now. He'd probably be a chief executive if you could project onto him what happened then to today. We talk about loyalty versus survival. There was a lot of loyal lieutenants, including one of my ancestors, William de Irvine. He was a loyal guy who fought all the way through and ended up being at Bannockburn and getting rewarded with land in 1314. James Douglas, the Black Douglas, if you're English, the good Douglas if you're Scottish. Again, he paid an incredible price. His father was starved to death in the Tower of London, I believe. He ended up taking the Bruce's heart to the Holy Land, and he was killed fighting the Moors in 1330 in Taba. So James Douglas had a difficult life too. And I think, all these lived experiences certainly, I think, are characters you can see in Scotland now. We're now back to a position where there is a huge gap politically between ourselves and England in quite a lot of the population. And I think in those days there was a similar situation. They were not going to let the English king take away the Scottish institutions such as the church and the legal system. And we've still got a separate church and still got a separate legal system as a result. And I think these times played a lot into that. So they created the nation that we now are in Scotland. And my books try and weave together all the different parts of the history, the events, the themes, and what actually happened during those times, and try to make it, for the modern reader, even though these events happened 700 years ago. Okay, next one, please. Character construction and narrative arc. Okay, so this is a kind of, I don't know, a patchwork of all the different characters. You have at the top the Emperor of Byzantium. There was two emperors at the time. There was joint emperors, there was a Michael and Andronicus, and they were very much interested in getting back what was stolen from them by the Crusades. So he's the guy at the top. The guy at the left-hand side, that's Bishop Wishart, an educated man and a man who gave up a lot. He ended up spending the best part of, I think he went to jail in 1306. He came out in 1316. So he spent nearly 10 years. And then when he did 1314, he came out, sorry, he was in jail for 8 years. He ended up coming out blind and died a couple of years later. So, he paid a big price. And he was an old man when he went to jail. He was probably in his 60s. So he must have been a very strong guy. And then on the right-hand side next to him, we have the King of England, it's Edward. And again, he had some good points, but in terms of Scotland, he definitely was trying to acquire Scotland without fighting a battle through having somebody who was his puppet. He would have totally immersed Scotland in English culture, and I think we wouldn't be the nation we were. So I look at him as a bit of a baddie and a bit of a villain in all of this. We then have the Bruce in the middle. There you go, centre stage, and I think he was an incredible man, the right man at the right time. Today we've got many wrong people in powers. I think he was really crucial and fundamentally important for Scotland. So he was the right guy at the right time. And then we've got some of the people I've made up and some of the people that existed. So we've got Christina down in the left-hand side, the beauty, and she did have an affair with Robert Bruce and is said to have had a son by him. There are some records. We then have Will de Irvine, who's to Bruce's right and your left, a character who was in his 30s. He had been he was at most of the battles, and he was at Bannockburn, as I say, he was rewarded afterwards. And then we have a character I made up to the right, on your right-hand side at the bottom next to Christina. That's Jamie Wishart. So of course, obviously, Bishop Wishart being a man in holy orders, he couldn't have had children, or certainly shouldn't have done. So I had to create a character who almost is like a young Bishop Wishart. So that's Jamie Wishart. And then just above him is a character called Hender Robertson, who's a kind of old hand who'd been at all the battles and has some issues of revenge. He's kind of a little bit wants to be a priest, but also harks back to his days as a soldier. He's a little bit of the in between and the glue between Will Dervin, who's an out and out soldier, and Jamie, who's a young man who has been a mason and is now working for his uncle. So all of them have different motivations in the sense that they're at different stages of their life, but they're all committed to having, in with the Scots case, having an independent Scotland. Then we've got the English king, he's motivated to conquer Scotland, and then we've got the Byzantines who basically want their money back. So they're all looking at different aspects, but they kind of are connected, and they did have personal connections, with the exception of the people I've made up. There was connections, and where those connections, as I say, are not supported by evidence, I have included some fiction to join the dots. And there was rising tensions within the Byzantine Empire. They had been conquered by the Latins. They had been kicked out of their own capital, and they had to fight their way back. And actually, what happened to them in the 13th century ended up, that was one of the reasons why the empire eventually fell to the Ottomans in 1453 in Constantinople. The English king, even though Edward was a very good king, for England, some of the things he did ended up, I think the Plantagenets, with the exception of Edward III, were on a downward spiral after Edward I. His son ended up being thrown off his throne and killed by his own wife and his nobles. So I think that there was a lot of things going on, and again, I put those in my books, and there was a lot of personal stuff that was at stake. As I say, Bruce lost his brothers, and there's convergence of individual and national journeys in the book, and I think that's an important part, and I tried to connect them with what's going on in Scotland. Okay, if you could go on to the next one, please. Which should be Where History Meets Fiction. So, with repeating myself, I've used primary sources where I can. I've integrated real events with the fiction, and I've used fiction to interpret some of these real events and the motivations behind them. And there's a nice picture of, I think that's Will opening up the treasure chest that he finds. And this is where the Byzantines come in, and that behind them is the fall of Acre. So if you read book 1, you'll understand why they're on a ship, and the Templar cross as well. That was going on, and the Templars were very much in the background in 1306 through to 1307 when they were suppressed, and right up to 1314 when they were burnt at the stake by Philip IV. So there's a lot of stuff going on in those years between 1286 and 1329 in terms of other events, which I try and weave in to the story. So I'm looking at the time. If you can move on to the next one, please. Which is should be How the 14th Century Defined Scottish Nationhood. Is that the one? A little bit more of a wordy slide.
Oops, sorry, the cat was on my keyboard.
No problem. So we should have How the 14th Century Defined Scotland's Soul. So I think it's defined nationhood. There's some shared memory. I'm sure Maureen's Scottish, and so is Michael. There's some of the shared memory and some of the collective trauma of what happened in those years and what happened in subsequent years. The Jacobite rebellion and that polarized the Scottish nation too, and then some of the cultural continuity that happened as a direct result of these events. I think that's an important thing to remember about these times, and I firmly believe that there was a lot that did get carried forward, and some of it got improved on, some of it got destroyed, and some of it got forgotten. So there was a lot of things happening, but I think on the whole we maintained our independence and got our had our separate church and separate legal system and separate education system, I think was largely derived from the events of the 14th century, with some other things that happened between then and now. But I think that was a really good basis and foundation and baseline for what went on. Language, Old Scots and Scots was still spoken well into the 16th century. In fact, James the Sixth of Scotland used to speak that. There was Norse spoken, the law, the landscape, and the lore, how things were done. Certainly, still it was and still is different between Scotland and England. And I think the wars of independence or the current disputes about whether Scotland should go its own way, whether it has a mandate, what does merit a mandate. Was 2014 a one and done? I think there's a lot of those debates and those discussions still happening. I think it was a period of immense courage. People did things, that I think I would struggle to do. And as being someone who wants a separate Scotland, I think, and what they really put up with and what they gave was probably far greater than we could imagine. Women were involved, I say Christina, Hid Bruce, and just surviving. I think one of the key things about Wallace is talked about as being a hero, even though he was only around and he was only successful from 1296 to about 1297. He left Scotland in 1299 to go to France. He gave Scotland a breathing space. He provided Scotland with a focal point and gave us some time to allow Bruce to come to the front. And as I say, there was a lot of myths that came out of all of this, and Social Glue, Bruce and the Spider, prophecies, and Blind Harry's the guy who wrote probably the best and most complete history of the Bruce, even though it's a poem. It talks about a lot of the events and who was involved. And then within my books, I fictionalize a lot of the national identity characters as I try not to do archetypes, guys wearing tartan and walking around the glens. I try to keep away from that. There wasn't that much of that, and there doesn't need to be that in the books, but getting away from the Walter Scott view of Scotland. And it's weaving some of the factual truth with some of the emotional truth. There's an interesting scene in the Outlaw King, which, if you like it or don't like it, it's at the end of the Battle of Loudon Hill, they're crying because those battles must have been so emotional and so telling on them as individuals. And I talk about Bruce, his illness. I don't think it was leprosy. I think he was stressed that, there's a lot of stuff that would have happened then would happen now, did under the pressure that people were in. If I could just move on, slide 15, I've talked about doing the research and methodologies. I'm just concerned if we've got 20 minutes left. How did I do this? I've read a lot. I read a lot of books. I read a lot of non-fiction. I spent a lot of time going around the sites and just feeling what went on and being there and understanding a lot about the people. I read a lot about the individuals, James Douglas, Robert Bruce, William Wallace, Elizabeth de Burgh, Edward I, a lot about them, and tried to get a real feeling of how they would have thought and how they would have been. So I did a lot of research on the individuals. And looked at the places. So I wandered around Castle Turum, which is mentioned in book 2. Stirling, the castle's there. Edinburgh. Edinburgh's actually more of a 19th century building, but there are some pieces there that you can go and see. And Bannockburn, you can go up and see. It's just a big field, but there's quite a lot of history and storytelling on the battlefield, so that's quite a good place to go. So there's lots of stuff still there that you can get a real sense for what was going on. I've looked at manuscripts. I've just looked at how they dressed. So, for example, when I was discussing the Byzantine empress, I did quite a lot of work on how she would have dressed and how the bishops would have dressed and how and what sort of jewellery they would have worn and how they would have been made up, and a little bit less for Scottish element, because they had woolen garments and hose and armor and stuff that we're all very familiar with. Not so familiar with what happened in Byzantium. So I did quite a lot of research there. Did a lot of research on one of my favourite characters, King Philip IV of France, who centralised a lot of the politics of France. He was a very handsome man, dressed beautifully, was interested in art. So again, I thought about how would he be and how would he dress and how would he look. And I used um, some of the facts about them to develop their characters. What were they interested in? Philip IV, for example, uh, loved his daughters more than his sons. So I had to say, well, why was that? What was his sons like? And they were a bit of his oldest sons were a bit of a wastrel, but his second son was more like him. Unfortunately, none of them made old bones, and actually, his daughter was the one who survived into her 60s and ended up becoming the mother of Edward III. So she was another female character who did well, and I was looking at how he would have viewed her. And as I say, balancing it all to make the fact and fiction work together and try to make, some of the people out and out horrible bees and some of them being very nice. But I tried to put some balance where I could find it. There's a character in the book called Aymer de Valence, who, whenever Edward needed somebody to go up and kill Scotsmen, it was Aymer de Valence he sent. So he's a bit of a fiend in the books. Okay, if we could move to slide 16. I'm conscious that we're kind of running out of time. We've only got sort of 16 minutes left, so uh, I think I'll not bother with the readings. What I was going to originally take some readings from Ray's Dragon. If you want, between pages 41 and 49, 50, there's a description of the politics of why killing John Comyn was a poor idea and why they had to crown Robert the Bruce as a result of that. There's an interesting wee side story, and I'll share that with you. When I was an archaeologist, I met a guy who was a stonemason at Lincoln Cathedral, and he told me that when they used to have their lunch, Mars bars, Walker's crisps, whatever they used to do, and they were working on a piece of stone, they would put them behind the piece of stone and shove the stone back. So I'm assuming in 300 or 400 years, when they're fixing that stonemasons will pull it out and they'll find what the stonemasons left in the 21st century. So I just used that story in the books as being, why wouldn't the masons do that? And he actually told me that when they pulled some stones out, they used to find chicken bones and remnants of the people who'd worked on that. And I thought that was a beautiful little story that I decided to put into my books. So slide 17, closing reflections. I think there's a lot to be learned from medieval Scotland. Resilient people, strong sense of community. If it had been a fragmented society, the independence wouldn't have lasted anything like as long, and it wouldn't have been successful. Bruce couldn't have done it on his own. He did it with the support of the people, and I think that's an important thing, and I think that's still true in Scotland now. And we've had, as a result of that, a cultural continuity that I think we're proud of. We've punched above our weight for years. We had education at the forefront and heart of Scotland. We still do, and I think that's a really important thing. And I think some of that came from lessons we learned in medieval Scotland. And why fiction? As I explained, it's an important thing in preserving memory, promoting memory. And maybe some people read my books and think, well, I'd really like to know what happened, so they read a history book. And I think I try to humanize the history and make it less dry. And it sparks inquiry. As I said, people go off and learn a little bit more about it. My upcoming work, I've got 2 books in the pipeline. One is The Murder at St. Olave's Priory, and then the next one's The Relics of St. Fillan. Again, themes that I've already mentioned, medieval themes. And I think it's they're a good adventure, and I hope they're a good story. Not just all about the history, but a good rip-roaring adventure that gets people interested. And if they learn about the history along the way, that's another bonus. if anyone's interested in finding out a bit more about me or the books or anything else, there's my contact email. And if anybody wants to buy any of the books, you can get them at Ringwood. That's the best place to get them. Or you can buy them on Amazon, and they're at bookshops. And I think you can get them via Lowman Books. Lowman Books have them on their website. So I've left about 15 minutes for questions. My parting shot really is thank you. I hope it's where history ends, story begins. So maybe that's where history has a gap, story begins. And thank you for listening. Thank you for letting me talk to you.